get started, please welcome Greg Bratton, longtime LOTR attendee, history buff, and conspiracy theory debunker. Give it up for Greg.
All right, I'm going to try to cram about 100, 125 years of history into about 20, 30 minutes. So I'm likely to forget a few things, but at least touch on the most important things. And then if you want to go to Q&A, well, then you can flesh it out there. So it's a, I am a history buff, so this is one of the most interesting stories in my opinion. Because, they were the richest family in the 19th century, and it was the rags to riches story. Because they literally came from nothing. So the guy who started it all was the one patriarch, I guess you could call him, Meyer Amschel Rothschild. And his name was Rothschild because in German, Roth is red and Schild is shield. So they had a red shield on their front door in the Judengasse, which was this German ghetto, or Jewish German ghetto in Frankfurt, Germany. So it all started in Frankfurt, Germany, which is about...
Keep talking. Keep talking.
I can't.
Whoa. Keep talking.
That's feedback.
There you go. Keep talking. Good.
Frankfurt's about central Germany, western side, closer to France. So they had, him and his wife had a ton of kids, and they ended up having 5 sons, which would end up becoming what we all know as the Rothschilds. Now, initially, he got his start by being a coin dealer. And he eventually moved to antiques, but when you're a coin dealer in that day and age, which is the mid-1700s, the late 1700s, your main clientele are aristocrats and people with money. And money to spend, because who else is going to spend money on little trinkets as coins that are rare, all sorts of other things like that. And then again, he moved to antiques and kind of spread his business, but these people tended to be spendthrifts. So, because they were landed aristocrats who just got money in every week, so they just kept on spending money. And what he eventually started doing was giving loans to these people, and then he got into banking. And he eventually, to piggyback one of the questions I got even before I came up here, he did he started creating relationships with certain politicians, and one of them was the Elector of Hesse. And that was kind of how they really got their start, which is one of the small German municipalities, which in the formerly known as Holy Roman Empire. But anyway, we'll try to not get bogged down in the details of that. Eventually, he gets the 5 sons, and the 5 sons are Nathan, James, Amschel Meyer, and Solomon and Carl. They would all. Nathan would go to London. James would be in Paris. And Amschel Meyer would be in Frankfurt, and Carl in Naples, and Solomon in Vienna. And they would all end up getting really tight-knit relationships with governments over the years. But the big one was when Nathan went over to London, because this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is where a lot of businesses are starting to take place.
There you go.
So he started a textile business for a little while and made some money at that, but eventually got into banking over there. And this is, again, so now we're talking about 1811 through 1814, this kind of period. So this is the Napoleonic era. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is very important to understand that this is not even possible without the French Revolution, because the 2 lasting effects, other than the metric system, of the French Revolution was the emancipation of European Jews and the breakdown of feudal rights and privileges. So Jews started to be able to own property, started to be able to move freely amongst the towns and different cities and things like that. That they simply didn't have that freedom before. And that's something that was, I guess you could say, one of the good things that Napoleon did. But during that time period, he was a mercantilist at heart, Napoleon. So obviously Britain ruled the sea waves, so he couldn't move anywhere. He couldn't contact his colonies. It's one of the reasons why he sold the Louisiana Purchase. So what he did in return to kind of give them help was that he was not going to let Britain trade at all with the continent. So he constructed the Continental System, what it was called. And during this time period, you had to smuggle anything in and out of between Britain and the continent. So what the Rothschilds ended up doing is taking that risk. So to the risk goes the reward. They were like, yeah, screw you. So they just ended up going around all these laws, and they started working with, and since at this point now they were international. That's also a very key point to why they were able to outcompete everybody else that they were competing with, was because they had contacts in all these different cities all over the place. And what the big thing that really started changing the trajectory of what their house would be was that they started moving gold. So they started snatching up all the gold they could because they were engaging in arbitrage for a lot of things. So again, since they were so interconnected in all these different cities, they would look at exchange rates and make all sorts of money off of differences in exchange rates. And so as they started getting good at collecting gold and getting it to the continent, the British government took notice, because this was a time period where if you wanted to pay your troops, you had to pay them in gold. They weren't going to accept paper money. So the British government was like, you're really good at doing this, so how about we'll pay for all this gold. If you can find us gold, we'll pay for it, and we'll give you a commission. And they made a ton of money off these commissions as they were moving gold all across the continent, as they were smuggling it all around. And actually, another little interesting tidbit is that Napoleon kept everything, all the laws in place, but he made an exception for gold, thinking that if you let more gold into France, that it would shore up his own currency and shore up his own bond purchases, and have a better currency for trading, all that kind of stuff. But he did not take into account that the people bringing it over would also give it to all of his enemies. So that's ultimately what they did. And again, at this time, as they were kind of doing all these transactions, they were also basically had a virtual monopoly, because for the British transfer payments from Britain to Austria, Prussia, and Russia. So all these transfer payments were all conducted by them, because at that point in time, Britain couldn't bring troops onto the continent, so they just brought money over and then had Austria, Prussia, and Russia raise their own troops, and the British just paid for it. So, and the people who conducted all these transfer payments were the Rothschilds. So, and again, because they had that international network, it was a symbiotic relationship, I guess you could say. Government needed them, and they needed the government. So, fast forward a little bit to Waterloo now, is where a lot of the myths comes from, especially like the one that the move the Nazis made. There was a lot of, basically the myth is that they manipulated the marketplace in order to get a bunch of British bonds to go down, and then they snatched them all up and make them go up once they got the news. Now, the truth is that they did get the news before anybody else from Waterloo. They got it before the government by 2 days. So, yeah, but what the real story is that they told the government a day later, but the government didn't believe them. So, and the reason why they got the information so much faster is that they had a courier system, which outcompeted everybody else during that time period, including whatever the government was providing. So you can think of it as like FedEx versus USPS. They were a private entity with the profit motive that allowed them to incentivize them to just speed up transactions of currency rates and all that kind of things like that. So they were able to just move information a lot faster than what the government was doing. So again, they knew it 2 days before, but they couldn't really make that quick of a move in the money market and all that kind of stuff. So now, again, since they were so used to moving gold, and since the troops needed gold, that it was called Napoleon's 100 Days. Yeah, I can get into that later, but he escaped from Elba, came back, and he was there for 3 months, and then he fights Waterloo, then it's all done. But they were under the impression that this was going to be a long war, because Napoleon was fighting for 15, 20 years all over Europe. But it was a quick, swift defeat. So they bought up all these gold purchases, and ultimately tried selling it to Wellington and other troops that were on the field, and they didn't want it because they didn't need it anymore. So they were kind of in a crunch at that point in time. And this is June 1815. So, but they were able to make at the behest of Nathan, they decided to eventually move all their gold and buy British bonds, British consols as they were called. And this, so usually a victorious country, especially the richest one in the world at that point in time, your bonds are probably likely going to go up after a war because people are confident in the government and they're confident that peace is going to return because it's basically on your behalf that peace is even there. So that ended up working out really well for them. And that was basically, so they already kind of had a really good money, a lot of money going on, but that was when it really started being meteoric. So they had that big rise from about 1850 to 1820, which is ultimately when they moved all this gold and bought British bonds. And they made a ton of money doing that. And then, so that's kind of how that original story is, how they came from nothing. Because when they were in the Judengasse, all the 5 sons lived in an attic together. Like they literally had absolutely nothing. And they were ill-educated. They just had a father that taught them the banking business and how to cozy up with politicians and how to, do graft, At that time, everybody was taking bribes. It's just how business got done in the 1700s. So they weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. That's just kind of how business got done. So, so I kind of just wanted to go over that, and then the courier system is really interesting to learn about, that they were just competing with government. So I'm going to move ahead a little bit to 1848 and talk about some of the bailouts that happened then. So there was revolutions all over Europe. I can get into that later too in the Q&A. And they started in Italy, but went to France and all over Germany, or the Germanic principalities, Austria and Prussia. And all these revolutions were basically onset by bad harvests, some deflation in the marketplace, bad investments not going very well. So all the populations all over Europe just uprose. It was, it's kind of like the Arab Spring kind of thing. Just all sorts of countries started doing it. And during this time period, usually, so at this point, the French Revolution brought them into an ascendancy that all the unrest and upheaval gave them an opportunity to rise. But now by 1848, they've got government bonds in all the nations, Austria, Prussia, Italy, France, Britain. So now they're kind of an entrenched power that wants the bonds to stay certain. All they want is certain loans, certain bond purchases to get their maturity back and make their money, make their interest rates. So they tended to not like war, but anyway, during the 1848 revolutions, so leading up to 1848, there really weren't that any wars going on from 1850 to 1848, so they weren't really doing a lot of loans. They did a few loans, and to be sure. So, okay, there's one more thing that I forgot about. The one thing that they really started creating that no one else had done before was the international bond market. So most of the time, or almost all the time, in 1818, they gave out a Prussian loan that you could consider them an emerging market kind of thing. So they were trying to encourage investment, and they didn't want to use their garbage currency. They wanted to use British pound sterling. So instead, they said, we'll give you a loan, but you're not doing it in Berlin, and we're not using your money. We're using British pound sterling, and we're doing it in London. And they had to accept it because they didn't really have a lot of options at that time. So they created this international bond market, and that was kind of their thing, and then everybody just followed suit, and that's kind of how the international bond market works these days. If you want to go buy, Brazilian loans or Cambodian loans, you can probably do it somewhere in the stock market today. So anyway, that was their one, I guess you could say, true financial innovation. But come 1848, most of their money is in that, and it's also in railroads. So it was kind of like a bubble too in the 1840s, where everybody was buying railroad stock, like joint stock companies, and trying to get these railroads made. And in Britain, it was mostly private, but in the rest of Europe, they were like public-private partnerships. So they got a little overextended in making investments in those. And then when the markets all tanked because of the revolutions, and they were all over Europe, the Paris house and the Vienna house ended up being very close to insolvency. But they didn't need to get the government involved because they were such a good network of international monetary funding that they were able to have, and they were a family, so they kind of looked out for one another. So when their two banks were close to insolvency, they got bailed out by Britain and by the London House and the Naples House and the Frankfurt House. So that was kind of interesting to learn about how they didn't need the government to kind of stay afloat in a crucial time, because it was in their own self-interest to keep things going. So that's kind of that was pretty cool. And then so again, without getting too bogged in details, I'll just kind of give an overview of most of the 19th century, because they were really important from 1815 to about 1914. And they started waning near the end because just over time, as the generations kind of started separating, they just weren't as tightly knit together anymore, with different interests, different investments, all those sorts of things. So their main influence was from about 1820 to about 1880 or so. And then it started to slowly wane, and then the world wars were just a deluge. They had a really tough time, and then obviously had a lot of stuff stolen from them during the Nazi era. Because their main, once they had all their money, it's always hard to get that first million, but once you have $1 million, you can start investing properly, which is what they did. But their main way of investing was a third in bonds and securities, a third in real estate, and then a third in art. So they had all sorts of art. So like when the Nazis came in, they stole a lot of their art. A lot of that stuff was from them. So, and they seeked them out specifically, but they only got like 2 of them. And one of them was even like an estranged wife, which they didn't have a name anymore. Anyway, in very general terms, they were very anti-war. And again, it was because of that reason that they were so invested in bonds all over the place that they wanted certainty and stability over anything else. Now, their peace was predicated upon trying to make money, ultimately. So there were certain instances where they could prevent war, but they really couldn't do it all that often in bigger countries. They could potentially have an influence that could persuade foreign policy for a smaller country, because they just didn't have that many options for loans. But for the most part, they were very anti-war, and the only times that they would make money in war would be for loans, obviously. But they didn't want a protracted war ever, because they wouldn't feel comfortable getting their money back. So it's one of the reasons why not too many long wars happened in the century of peace, as what's known between the Napoleonic era and the World War I. They played their role. So the they were, one of the interesting stories too is the De Beers story. So they were part of De Beers in the diamond monopoly, but they were just the investor. They were never hands-on in imperial things. So it was never a big part of their overall portfolio. And they never really gotten involved in America either. And part of the reason why was because they started looking around right around the crisis of the Bank of the United States with Andrew Jackson. And it was like in the mid 1830s where they started making investments with the Bank of the United States. But by that time, it was just a state bank, as it devolved from the federal to a state Pennsylvania bank. And then it went belly up, and they lost some money, and they're like, we're not doing this again. So as the and also they didn't have anybody in the family who wanted to move over to America. So they never got, as London became, or as New York became London, ultimately, as far as the financial capital of the world, they kind of lost that out. So as one of the kind of the bellwethers was when the Boer War happened in 1899 to 1902. The British government did not go to the Rothschilds; they went to J.P. Morgan for loans. So to make that war happen. So in again, the kind of the maxim, I guess you see, or the axiom that they had was not peace at any cost, but profit under any circumstances. So if they could figure out a way to make money, that's usually what they did. So like there were certain times, like in 1866, there was the Bismarck War with Austria and Germany. It was like the German Civil War over who would kind of control things over in the German Confederation. And it was a short-lived war, but Austria had no business fighting that war because they knew what their financial situation was, which was bad. And but for pride and all that kinds of things, they suggested to just sell them the land so they could get money and then have shore up their currencies and all kinds of things like that. But they didn't do that. They fought the war and lost. But what they did was they sold all their bonds like right before the war because they knew what was about to happen because they talked to all these politicians. And then then like immediately they took out a loan from them. So again, what would I do? I would do the exact same thing. so in very general terms, that's kind of the big picture. They're a very interesting family. They're still around today. You can watch like BBC documentaries with like some of the current guys who are still alive. They run museums of their old houses. I mean, they got fabulously wealthy. But they weren't angels. I think the grossest thing was learning about was the original 5 sons, like more or less like made all their kids marry each other to keep the money in the family. So there was incest. Yeah.
Everybody was doing it.
Yeah. I mean, again, I get it.
If you had that kind of money, you would do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, come on, you really want to give money to Catholics and stuff. So that was kind of, again, they weren't angels, but overall, I think they were a good force for a time period that was still in, before, I guess you could say, the modern era, because after World War I and World War II, the financial situation all over the world was just hard to compare because it was completely different back then. Back then, the Rothschilds were so big that they basically had enough capital to compete with central banks. Like, they were that big. There were certain times where when the central bank had a liquidity crunch, they bailed them out. And again, they obviously made money eventually, but they were the ones who provided the liquidity. And that's pretty impressive. So they overall were, I think, good for the world. And but it's it's too bad a lot of the anti-Semitism in the 1930s and 40s really kind of shadowed a lot of the things that they did or didn't do. Because they were just human beings acting in their own self-interest after a certain point. And you can't fault anybody for doing that. But it was kind of interesting that the anti-Semitism really ramped up when they had virtually no power over politics anymore. Because by that time, there were so many other options for governments. Again, the financial center changed from London to New York, so they didn't have all the controls that people thought they did by that time. But at that time, they just had so much money. There was so much financial crisis going on that they just got blamed for everything. So, yeah, very general. Good, interesting people. That's about it.
I neglected to ask you about this before the talk. You said that there was like a symbiotic relationship between the Landsgrave of Hesse and Meyer-Eschel Rothschild. What was this relationship? Like, it seemed more.
Right. Okay. So he was. Yeah, this is a good story. So you might know the Hesse Castle. He was Hessian. So they may recognize the Revolutionary War. He sold a lot of his troops to Britain, the highest bidder, and that usually ended up being Britain. So during the Revolutionary War, those Hessians were coming from this guy. And the Elector of Hesse Castle is the king, but they called him the Elector because they were elected kings back then. Elected by like a small band of people. But anyway, he was one of the few guys because of things like that. He was kind of a tight ass. So he wasn't a spendthrift like a lot of the other guys that they dealt with. So he had money. And what ended up happening was that he sided with Austria and Prussia during the wars with Napoleon. And when Napoleon came through, he knew it. So he had to flee to England. But the Rothschilds basically helped him by helping kind of get a lot of his money out of the way and hidden from Napoleon, because that was basically, so Britain financed all their Napoleonic wars through borrowing, and France did it by just taking from the place they just ran into. So that's kind of that's how they did it. So they helped him while he was out of town, more or less. And then what they did was they used that financial leverage to help make loans for themselves. So because okay, we got all this money from this guy now, so they kind of used it as part of their balance sheet. And even though he didn't really know that was happening. So that was kind of how that happened, and then eventually got to a point where they had so many political friends that he wasn't as important once the big father died, which was like 1804 or 5 or something like that.
Did he ever get his gold back?
I don't recall.
Okay.
So I'm gonna go left to right. So, Tyler.
You would go left.
Did the last thing you mentioned was the intermarriage between the cousins. Did they have any genetic problems a couple generations down the road?
You know, it wasn't really mentioned all that often. I can imagine there's a few of them. It's the classic phrase of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. You know, once you get all that rich and you don't really have that pressure to make money, because again, that first generation, I mean, they were very smart and worked very hard at what they did. But you know, once you get all that money, you just don't care anymore. So there was some of that in the family, but I don't necessarily know of any defects or like things like that.
Well, what about the lizard people? No, in all honesty, why? It's pretty straightforward. They're banking and stuff. Why is there so much conspiracy around the Rothschilds?
There's nothing quite. There's nothing. What unites the left and right the most is probably anti-Semitism. You know what I mean? Because that was actually, at first, there was a left that really hated Jews in the 1830s and stuff because they were associated with the reactionary governments. So after 1815, when Napoleon got thrown down, all the governments were like, we're just going to act like this never happened. The French Revolution. So they were seen as bankrolling all the old kings that came back into power and making their regimes more stable and not allowing more freedom and all that kind of stuff, which was largely out of their control at the end of the day. But that was kind of how it was. And then the right eventually just launched in the 1930s and stuff. But anybody who has a lot of money and is in banking, who makes it without working with their hands, tends to elicit a lot of envy, ultimately. And since again, and part of it, this is also a good historical thing to say, is that part of the reason why they got into banking in the whole first place was that they were never allowed to own property, so they got to figure out some way to make money. So they figured out how to, they had to get smart. They had no choice, otherwise they were going to die. So that's kind of how that worked out. They got into banking. I think it was Rodney.
Family legacies are so fluid. I mean, there's a lot of families that have a lot of money at one time, and then 50 years later, all the families broke. What has made the Rothschilds so profitable for so long?
Right. A lot of it was those initial agreements. So they were always they would it was just filial unity. It's hard to say other than that. They would make these agreements every 10 or 15 years or whatever. That would just say, hey, this is how we're going to share all of our profits between all of our houses. So if any of you guys get down, we're going to help you out. And then again, focus on education, I guess you could say. They always were very keen on trying to get them educated, and then once they got to a certain point, they had tutors come into their house, and like Chopin and Mozart, well, maybe not Mozart, that was too late. But yeah, they just had a family bond, because Jews do tend to stay together because they're all getting hated upon equally everywhere. So there was like, well, we're all in this together ultimately at that point. So there was more of a connection and more of a trust, I guess you could say, and they just kind of kept it going on.
What's the biggest conspiracy theory about them that's actually true? Or like, what's the biggest influence they've had at one point in time that might
they're always accused of hoarding, obviously. But I don't really know. I'll be honest, I don't get into too many conspiracies that deep. But the one that everybody always talked about was that one from Waterloo, that they manipulated the marketplace. Now, a lot of times they would try to not do that because they got so good at what they were doing that everybody followed their movements. It's kind of like what everybody does now with like Warren Buffett. Oh, what is he buying and selling? So that exact same thing happened to them in the 1820s and 30s. But they didn't want to influence the marketplace so much because they didn't want bubbles to follow them, more or less. So they would actually buy all sorts of different things in different places and then like hide what they were really doing because they just too many people follow them.
What is your source for the debunking of the Waterloo incident that occurred in London?
Yeah. My favorite historian, this probably is my favorite historian, is Neil Ferguson. And I just love all his books. But he's a financial historian. He's kind of like an Adam Smith guy, so he's mostly libertarian, has some conservative elements, but he's a really smart guy. And he had access to the original documents. So all the correspondence between the brothers, they gave him access. The family did. So he's got all sorts of scripts of what they were talking about at the time and what they were saying, all sorts of things like that. So that's that. I just kind of convey what he conveys, and I say I believe him. So you got to believe somebody at some point.
Weren't these reports that estimate their wealth at 500 trillion? Is that even possible that it could
I don't think today. I don't know, obviously. But I would not think so today. A fair amount of their estates that they had are now museums that they just kind of gave to the government ultimately. And nowadays they're just like an investment consulting firm. So they still make money, to be sure, but it's nothing like they had back in the past where like nobody else had that kind of money that they had. So whatever it is, it's probably substantial, but that sounds a bit high.
On the books of the 7 billion.
You, I'm sorry.
So how do they manifest today? How do you know what, like, they are companies or just consulting?
Yeah, it's mostly just an investment consulting. I know they had some investments in the North Sea for oil and stuff like that. So, yeah. I mean, and I think they still invest in government bonds and things like that. But I didn't, again, most of the stuff I like to concentrate on was the older era, because that's like my favorite era, is the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. So, then I got more reading. Somebody raised 2 people, just one? Did I? Okay, Josh.
So, kind of an answer to what Jeff's question was. I think one of the bigger conspiracies is that 4 of them were named in Epstein's Black Book. So that's one.
Oh, really?
Yeah. 4 of
Say
them.
that again. I didn't hear you.
Four of the Rothschilds are named in Epstein's Black Book, which doesn't guarantee anything, but that's a weird place to look at it. Secondly, I've heard there are very times like Bilderberg. Is that true?
Yeah.
And how much influence do they have on world politics?
He's talking about Bilderberg and how much they have on. Yeah. I know.
They built the owl.
Yeah. Again, I'll be honest with you. I don't get into these wormholes too often, really. So I can't say anything about the Bilderbergs. I'll be honest with you. But again, world politics, they aren't a big player. Today, financial decisions are all made by the IDF, the central banks. They control the power. They're basically, because this is something that I was talking to you about, but I forgot to mention. Over most of the 19th century, all the governments kind of got annoyed by the fact that they had all this loan money from these guys, and they're like, why don't we just tax them? So over the 19th century, the income tax comes in, the inheritance tax comes in, and they just started taking it from them that way. Instead of having to loan money from them, that's kind of how they got their money. So, world politics today, they're just another firm at this point. I think you're next.
You mentioned that at the beginning that troops had to be paid in gold; they couldn't get paid in paper money. Do you think that has anything to do with why the 19th century was so much more restrained, especially towards the end, than the 20th century, where the troops were getting paid in paper?
Right. I think it wasn't at the beginning. I think it was just a lot more expensive to really have these long, protracted wars. And the biggest reason why the Napoleonic Wars were so long was because of Napoleon. You know, no one really wanted to fight that long, but he just wanted to. He just had. He wasn't. He was. I would still call him a tyrant, but he wasn't as bad as like Hitler. But he. Yeah. They realized it was never going to stop, so that's what they did.
But like from the 1880s, like the wars that you saw, even the major wars that had like Prussian marching down the streets of Paris, were much more restrained than World War I.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I'll say I don't know when that transition happened where they stopped being paid in gold. I don't know when it stopped, I guess you could say. I think this guy is next. I'm sorry, I don't.
I'm just gonna talk.
Okay. So, do you think, so you talked about how, like, the governments had to turn to them for financing, and maybe once the central banks became stronger, like, do you think that central banks broke their power or enhanced it?
They eventually broke it, ultimately. They started creating these different kind of, you know, I guess you could say creative financing. It's interesting to learn about historical finance because they got more creative over the era. So like they started making these banks that were like in the 1850s, that were like mutual fund banks. So in order to encourage investment for all these railroads, they essentially would give people guaranteed returns and things like that, which they knew were cutting into what the Rothschilds were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. So those banks ended up failing. But they were good for like 10 or 20 years. Justin.
So they had this huge first mover advantage. What did J.P. Morgan do to be able to compete eventually with the Rothschilds? Were they innovative in financial instruments or something? Or how did they get to that position?
Yeah, they must have. I will say that would be. I need to do more research on that.
I think I actually have the answer for that.
Oh, there you go.
Like so the Kennedys, well, this is kind of a diversion, but like the founder of the Kennedy dynasty, he did what we would call insider trading. There wasn't this kind of, there wasn't much regulation of like how much reporting had to go on to financial statements. So if you had inside information, you'd get a head start on the rest of the market pretty easily. And also insider trading was more legal back then, so that was a huge part of how the JP Morgan got ahead, or helped them got ahead.
That is a good point. Now I'm not a fan of regulation in the big scheme of things, but there really were no rules back then. So, because they were all figuring out how to finance all these things ultimately at the end of the day. So in the early 1800s and mid 1800s, it was just like the Wild West. Like if you kind of got away with something, just keep doing it. So, yeah. Is it Rodney now?
No, man, you already answered.
One last question. Last question. Anyone? All right. Give it up for Greg.
I do have one last thing. I brought visual aids. This is not Rothschilds related, but I do have some old French currency from the French Revolution that was essentially bonds, but they printed so many of them that they turned them into currency, so people just traded them as like currencies. And then I have, gotta love the Zimbabwe $1 trillion bill. I got some Venezuelan currency here too. And then I also recently, when I was back home for Christmas, my sister never told me my grandpa had these Russian war bonds from 1960. So, and there's one that's like from 1898, but those are really interesting to look at because they're in French. And just another little historical tidbit is that France was heavily invested in Russia. It's one of the reasons why they fought together in World War I. So if you want to check them out, go ahead and check them out.
Right on. Thanks, Greg. Thanks to everybody for coming out. We will be back the first Wednesday of next month. So we're the first and third Wednesday of every month, not every other. So don't show up when we have an extra Wednesday. Thanks everybody for coming out.
Free stuff.
Keep fighting the state. Don't forget about all the free stuff in the back. If you guys want to support us, libertyintherocks.org/donate. And go buy our shit, spontaneousorder.store. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.